welcome to Kankakee Podcast, where we talk about the people and places of Kankakee County. I'm Jake LaMore, and this is another episode with members of the Kankakee County Museum, where we talk about something historic in our county's history. Before we get to that, though, just want to remind you that if you are a history buff or you're just very adamant about preserving our local history in the county, you too can become a member of the Kankakee County Museum. And that helps keep the lights on, keeps artifacts moving, coming in, new exhibits, all kinds of things. And members do get discounts on certain things, including the gift shop, exclusive events, and more. So make sure you go to KankakeeCountyMuseum.com to check that out. And then also, as far as upcoming events go, the biggest one that's going to be coming up here soon, if you're listening to this before May 18th, is the 35th Annual Rhubarb Festival. And I do know that they are accepting vendors right now. It's a perfect place, actually, to get the word out about, your business, or maybe you're a crafter or whatever it might be, because there's always a really good turnout at the Rhubarb Fest, because it's a free festival, and it's always a lot of fun, family-oriented. So you can consider becoming a vendor for that. But if you want to get more details on the Rhubarb Festival, you can just go to the museum's website or Facebook or Instagram pages for that. There's a link to get more information on becoming a vendor. But that'll be at the main campus at the Kankakee County Museum. So I am always pleased to welcome Jack Klasey and Jory Walters. Welcome to you both.
Welcome. I'm always happy to be here.
Yeah, good to have you here. So today, we are going to be celebrating the year 2025. We're celebrating the 150th anniversary of the village of Bourbonnais. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, what some people might not realize is that really it should be 150th plus anniversary, yes. Right?
That's right.
The 150th anniversary just celebrates the incorporation of the village.
Right, 1875.
But we're going to dive in today and actually learn that the village itself, Bourbonnais itself, is actually older than that.
Yeah, you can't get much more historic than Bourbonnais. That's where it all began.
Right? I mean, when it comes to, I guess, modern Kankakee County, right? That's where it started.
Pretty much so, yes. Well before it was part of Will County at that time.
True. Mm-hmm. Yes. Very true.
Yeah. Oh, not in 1875, but when it started, yes.
Yes, exactly.
That was around the 1830s.
Yeah. So where do we want to start? Do we want to start with the Native Americans that were here? Are we going that far back? Or where are we starting when some of the French settlers started coming in? Where do we start with Bourbonnais?
We could touch in a way upon the Potawatomi, who were here, of course, before any of the European-based or non-Indian settlers. And they were basically left this area in 1833 after a treaty with the federal government, and the people were all moved basically to Iowa and then further west. The first official permanent settler, European settler, I think, in Kankakee County or in Bourbonnais was a man named Noel Levasseur. Very familiar name for anybody who reads anything about Bourbonnais. But the question is, okay, he was the first permanent settler, but where does Bourbonnais come in?
Yes.
Francois Bourbonnet Sr. was an old, literally old, I think he was probably in his 60s or 70s at that time, fur trader who has settled in the grove of trees near what is now the Y in Bourbonnais. It was called La Pointe because it was a point of land that was covered with mature trees and so forth.
Is that also why there's the Noel Levasseur, I don't know if you want to call it a monument or what, but there's that big stone that has his name on it, and it says when he was born and when he passed away.
Yeah, that marks more or less his trading post area was right in there at the center of what is now Bourbonnais. That was the junction of two long-standing trails coming from the south up, and one to Chicago, and the other, which is now 102, heading out to the west toward Joliet, and eventually cutting back and into Chicago from the southwest. Bourbonnet moved on to Iowa with his Native American wife when the Potawatomi were moved beyond the Mississippi. But Noel Levasseur originally came to this area as a trader for the American Fur Company, along with Gurdon Hubbard, who was the agent for the fur company in Illinois, and they established a trading post down in what is now Iroquois County, a place called Buncombe, which is now, I think, the town of Iroquois.
In Iroquois County?
In Iroquois County, yes. I think so. Let me double check.
It's not Buckley, is it?
No. No, it's now the village of Iroquois in Iroquois County, over near Papineau.
Okay.
But Gurdon Hubbard, as many of the fur traders did, married into the Potawatomi tribes, married a relative of the chief and so forth. Her name was Wachiki. She was the niece, I believe, of Chief Tomine, whose village was in that area. When Hubbard decided to move into the growing town of Chicago and become a merchant and a mover and shaker in the big town, he divorced Wachiki with the rather rudimentary type of divorce we used that time. I think he walked 3 times around and said, "I divorce you."
Are you serious?
No, I think I've read something along those lines, and I'm not sure all the details, but it was something as essentially casual as that.
Walk around 3 times and you're divorced.
Yeah.
As simple as that.
It's a lot cheaper than going to Vegas.
Yeah, in that time.
But anyway, Levasseur rather quickly married Wachiki to carry on the relationship with the tribe there. And of course, then eventually in, what was it, Jory, 1832, I think, that they came north?
Yes. Came to Bourbonnais. It was actually called at one time Bourbonnais.
Like bull? Like a bull?
Like a bull in China shop.
Yeah.
And as we were talking before, the names have been kind of distorted over a time period. Many different names have been either anglicized or French, or
or a combination,
of what was native into modern.
Yeah. It was more or less a case of what did it sound like? How would you pronounce it?
Yeah.
The original name of the settlement or the area there when Bourbonnais was there was called La Pointe, as I mentioned earlier.
Yes.
However, it later developed into Bourbonnais Grove, which is, of course, now still is the name of the historical society there and the general settlement.
Did it become known as Bourbonnais Grove when Levasseur kind of?
Yes, I think during his period of time when he lived in the area and was more or less the king of Bourbonnais, he was responsible for virtually everything that went on in the town. Yeah, Jory mentioned the Bourbonnais. That was one of the corruptions of Bourbonnais. Probably Bour came out sounding more like bull if you said it rapidly.
Mm-hmm.
But for many, many years, when I first came to Kankakee in 1863, I'm old, but I'm not that old.
You look really good for 1860s there, Jack.
It was a standing joke or observation among the people I worked with at the Journal that you could always tell when they had a new announcer on radio station WKAN because he would use the formation Bourbonnais, whereas all of the locals, of course, called it Bourbonnais.
Yep.
And then, of course, the Bourbonnais was right in there, too.
Yeah, if you want to just do a test or just in your mind, if you're having a conversation with someone and they say Bourbonnais, you know that they've probably been here for a long time.
That's right.
But pre-1976, So.
Yeah, the village board eventually decided, and I think this may have been part of the bicentennial or something of this sort, that they really should come out with a specific official consecrated name that would be official. And so they passed an ordinance in the village board that said, henceforth, we will be known as Bourbonnais. And they still are.
I'm glad they did, because it kind of helps with the confusion.
That's right.
Yeah.
Try to get everyone on the same page.
It really goes back to the French roots
Yes.
of the community,
Oh, yes.
which leads into the next section of the
Yes, of
Maternity BVM Church. Now, anybody who is familiar with Bourbonnet is familiar with that church, whether you're Catholic or not. It's been there forever and a day. Beautiful, absolutely beautiful church. It actually was a log cabin kind of chapel.
The Chapel of St. Leo, it was called.
At one time. And you can imagine this little log cabin church and we're going to get into St. Viator's, a couple of buildings for that, and maybe one other building for Bourbonnais, and that was it. That was what you had for the village of Bourbonnais.
That was one of the first buildings built, was the church, right?
Yeah, in 1841, which is pretty far back.
Yes, it is.
And then it burned, and then they built the one that is there.
Yeah, in 1850 was when the second church, which was replaced the log cabin, was a wooden church, and that burned in 1850. I'm sorry, in 1853. It was built in 1850 and burned down. And that was a bit controversial because it was involved with some of the issues with Father Charles Chiniquy, whom we'll touch upon in greater detail later. But to replace the church that burned down, the parishioners built the current church in stone. They did the quarrying out along the river and so forth, and hauled all of the stone on wagons and so forth. And over a period of roughly 3 to 4 years, 1854 to 58, they built that church with their hands of the congregation itself. Interestingly enough, if you've ever been to Quebec, especially up and down along the river there, a lot of the smaller towns have churches that will seem very much like what you see when you walk into Bourbonnais. I think, if I remember, Father LaBelle, who was the pastor of the church in 1854, had a set of drawings, of plans for a church that was based on one of the churches in Quebec, and I think it was something about Cap Saint Ignace. My horrible French pronunciation is horrible, but I know I've been in a number of churches in Quebec on visits, and I've been amazed at how similar that whole idea of the second story with balconies on either side and the drum
church.
Yes, there's the beautiful church there.
Yes, there it is.
Is very common and very interesting type of architecture. And of course, that is the oldest church building in Kankakee County.
Yes, that's correct.
It's not the oldest congregation, interestingly enough.
No.
And I've forgotten the name of the congregation, but it's there's a small church out between Grant Park and the state line.
Sherburville.
Sherburville, yes. Sherburville Christian Church.
Yes.
The building is not, but that congregation is actually the oldest church congregation in all of Kankakee County.
That's Yellowhead Township.
I believe it is, yeah.
Right there, considered.
Yeah, I think so. If you're, let's see. Yeah,
I think it's Yellowhead.
It probably is Yellowhead. I think otherwise Janier, but that's further south, I think.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So anyway, it's pretty interesting. We were talking a bit about Father Chiniquy, of course.
Yes. But before, there's one question lingering in my brain before we move on to Father Chiniquy. The the one-room schoolhouse.
Oh, yes, the log cabin school.
The log cabin schoolhouse that you can actually go see in Bourbonnais. I'm trying to remember what the date was on that, because it was not far from when the first maternity church.
1837.
1837. So
it was, a log cabin school was built on Main Street.
The schoolhouse.
There it is. Yes,
so that does predate the church then.
It does predate the church.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah, and it was a school for several years, and actually was administered from Joliet, of course, because it was part at that time it was part of Will County.
French.
And then eventually it became a private residence for many years. The logs covered up with siding. For a time, there was actually a gas pump out front that was, I think, a sort of general store for a while. And when I think it was the logs were discovered sort of by accident. I don't think it was known in advance, or maybe it was just kind of generalized that this was the building that was a school, a log cabin school, until they started peeling the siding off and found the logs.
Well, we did a whole episode on this a few years back when they unveiled the log schoolhouse, which again you can go see in Bourbonnais. It's really cool. And then I know Mayor Shore has talked about it too. I think you could actually see the logs if you went into the basement of the house.
Yes.
I think you could actually see the logs.
Yes, you could actually. I think I've seen a picture. In fact, I think maybe Vic Johnson or someone who's, of course, very much close to the history of this area. I think I had seen a picture he had taken one time down in the basement. You could look up on the external wall and see the internal wall and see that. Yeah. But anyway, once this was discovered, the village decided this has to be preserved. Mm-hmm. It was... A lot of it was decayed and in bad shape, but they very carefully disassembled the building and stored it away in a safe storage house protected from the weather. And it sat there for a number of years until the ability to do something about it.
Raise money
to be able to move and restore the place, or actually not move, but relocate from its original spot.
It took them a long time to raise that money because I think the house was demolished in somewhere around 2010, 2011.
Yeah, pretty far back.
Yeah. And then it wasn't until, like I said, just a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago that...
It was 2011 when it was disassembled.
Okay, it was 2011. Okay.
Yeah,
I knew it was right around there.
Bourbonnais Grove Historical Society, we had a dinner every year
to raise money for it and solicit.
So like 10 years to raise the money for that. So I'm just so thankful that they were persistent, because those things take time.
That's right.
And it is a beautiful, beautiful building.
Yes. Right. Yes, it is.
And of course, its companion piece right next door, the Letourneau House, which is the headquarters for Bourbonnais Grove Historical Society, was also built in 1837.
I didn't realize they were built the same year.
Pretty close. Pretty much was originally located, would be just to the east of the Clancy Gernon Funeral Home, back in that area where the parking lot is.
And I believe that house was moved.
It was, yeah. George Letourneau's house was moved to the current site and restored in 1986.
And it was originally the post office.
Yes.
Correct.
So it had any number of possibilities, but the Letourneau family lived there for many years. And George Letourneau was a fascinating person. He was the first village board president of Bourbonnais, and later moved to Kankakee and became the mayor of Kankakee.
I always forget that part. I always remember he was the first mayor of Bourbonnais, but I forgot that he went to Kankakee too.
Right, and he also was the Kankakee County Sheriff at one time, and a state senator. So this is a Renaissance man. He was involved in all kinds of things.
Interesting in Kankakee area history that some of the biggest names are associated with many different roles. They get around.
Yes. Well, especially at that time. Excuse me. Especially at that time when the population was a lot smaller.
That's right.
You could have all of these different roles. And I think some people automatically think right away, they think, oh, that's corruption. It's like, not necessarily. We were a lot smaller of a community back then, and there was only so many people that could do that job or wanted to step up to do the job. It's kind of like going back to the whole like George Washington being the first president. They had to like they had to really pull him in to do that because he didn't want to be president.
In 1900, population of Bourbonnais was 595 people. Back in the period when, in 1875 and so forth, I don't have the 1870 census figure, but I suspect it was somewhere to 300 to 400.
In the 1870s?
Yes.
Yeah, now let's pause for just a moment. Let's go back to the church for a moment.
Oh, yes. Sorry, Jory.
I apologize.
That's okay. No, there's just something I want to kind of emphasize. When the French came to our area, they settled from Quebec. Now, they didn't just come here and settle. They brought people, and they went back to Quebec, and they brought more people, and then more people. So we have a very, very healthy bloodline from Quebec. I'm one of those.
I say it all the time. I am too.
I'm an outlander, unfortunately.
Jack is the odd man out.
I'm a Leclerc and Papineau, 2 lines for that. But it's important because Bourbonnais is a very kind of French-oriented bloodline. Kankakee and Bradley are a mix of a lot of different nationalities.
Right. They're the melting pots.
Yes, more so. I won't say Bourbonnais isn't, but in the beginning, not really, because Bourbonnais was agricultural, whereas they didn't really want industry, whereas Kankakee was industrious. Bradley was built to be industrious. You had to bring in the other populations that settled there and within the county, all kinds of nationalities, whereas the French pretty much stayed
very insular.
Yeah, and like you said, agriculture driven.
Yeah, they were much more of the land. They were originally fur traders,
basically farmers, and
they really wanted to stay that way.
Yes,
they were not terribly interested in the modern.
Speaking from personal experience, yes, I can tell you that. I can tell you that's how my my ancestors were. I've always been told that. So it's very much about farming.
That was part of the reason why attracting immigrants from Quebec worked. First of all, of course, you had Noel Levasseur, who was actively promoting that. He had managed to acquire quite a bit of land in old Indian sites and so forth. And so he went back to Quebec and was promoting the idea of move down here. And the message was received very happily because at that time in Quebec, it was very, very hard to get land. Most people couldn't afford land. It was held by quite a few large landowners, mostly English background. And so it was very difficult to find a place to settle and raise your family on a farm.
So Quebec at that time, was that under British rule?
It was at that point, yes. It was after the British basically defeated the Quebec forces or New France forces, and it became a colony of England.
So they were kind of fleeing, I guess, in a way.
In a way, yeah. In 1830s something, I don't remember, there was something called the Papineau's Revolt, which was a very short-lived agrarian revolt against the name Papineau, of course, ended up
right.
With
we have one of the towns in right over County. The border into Iroquois. Yeah,
and I'd like to read just a quote here. There was in 1900, the Chicago Sunday Chronicle did a feature story on Bourbonnais, and the name of the author was not at it, but he had kind of an interesting take on what kind of a community it was. He said, "It is so peculiar, so thoroughly French, so picturesque that it becomes distinctive among American towns." And he went on with, let's see. Oh, he came first by train to Kankakee and then took the trolley car out to Bourbonnais. And said the first glimpses of the town are charming. The electric car line extends from Kankakee through Bradley and quite to the end of Bourbonnais. It is like passing along the bare stripped branch of a November tree and suddenly leaping into the sweet fullness of foliage. It is all gold with sun and dandelions and green, with wonderful color of spring, and the houses, built by Alec Lamontagne, painted in soft colors, are white and rain-washed and do not stare hard on the eye.
I think the village of Bourbonnais, I should talk to Lindy Casey and have her read that, because I feel like they should use that in their marketing now.
They probably should.
The way he paints Bourbonnais in there is just so...
It is, yeah. And there's an even longer and quote and very lyrical sort of thing, but we can get this information to
Yeah, that's painted so beautifully.
That's right.
Yeah.
So anyway, we mentioned, of course, that Levasseur was the primary first wave of Quebec settlers. The second was Father Chiniquy.
Oh, okay.
He was a Canadian priest, a Quebec priest who was well known and, in fact, quite famous. He was sort of the rock star of the time in the 1850s and so forth. As a temperance crusader, there was a real drinking problem in general, or a lot of places. You had a big temperance movement, but among the French Canadians, there was a real alcohol problem, apparently. And so he crusaded to take the pledge and all this sort of thing. So he became very, very well known. The story is that he was asked by the bishop of the Archdiocese of Chicago to come down and run a temperance movement in Illinois with amongst the French Canadians there. So he did come to Chicago, where there was quite a French Canadian church. I think the Church of Notre Dame parish there. But also then he came down to Kankakee, to Bourbonnais. A good meeting. It was a smaller group than he would have had in Chicago, of course. But also he, in 1851 is when he came to Bourbonnais, and he had, after a very short time, he had something in mind. He said, we need to form a colony down here in this beautiful country that will be settled by settlers from Quebec. So he found a place out southeast of Kankakee, which of course didn't exist yet at this point, but Kankakee was not quite ready yet, but in what was then Iroquois County, a place that became called St. Anne, which was the name he picked for his colony, and he immediately began trying to attract settlers.
But he started in Bourbonnais.
He started in Bourbonnais, and actually was in 1852. He was in addition to his St. Anne colony, he became the pastor of the Maternity BVM Church.
Okay.
Which at that time had been burned down, of course. And there was always kind of a hint that maybe during his earlier days crusading down there that he had something to do with burning the church, but it was never proven. But
interesting. Why did people think he?
He was in a battle with one of the other priests in the areas. I think Father LaBelle or one of his priests.
A bit of a rabble rouser.
Oh yeah.
He eventually got excommunicated.
Yes,
I know we touched on that in another podcast episode.
The Vatican's like, you're out.
Right.
Yeah, he was in a long-standing war with the bishops of Chicago, and eventually they came out and nailed down an order to the church door an order of excommunication, saying,
"You're done.
Yeah, you're fired."
Yeah.
He's like,
what a way to go.
Fine, then I'm going to go find myself another church. So he did. Presbyterian Presbyterian, I
He
believe.
later became
In
Presbyterian.
St. Anne.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
After he formed a Catholic one in St. Anne.
Mhm.
And then he went back. And then followers did follow him back to St. Anne and into the other Presbyterian church. But he had a hard time. He was in a legal battle with a gentleman named Mr. Spink.
Right, Peter Spink.
Peter Spink, over some type of libel. I don't remember exactly, but
I think it was something to do with the transfer of some land.
Yep. And then a young lawyer named Abraham Lincoln was the
Spink had filed suit against Chiniquy for whatever deal was involved, and Chiniquy decided to hire this young, well-known lawyer out of Springfield named Abraham Lincoln.
I couldn't remember which one Lincoln was representing. I can't remember. If
he was representing Chiniquy.
And I have a full, huge
Such
box
a small world.
dedicated to Father Chiniquy.
Yeah.
If anybody's interested, I have a humongous pile. And I have the entire Spink trial. That was one of my first research requests when I first started here.
Okay.
And so I copied all of it. It was huge. But yeah, so that was one thing that Father Chiniquy did. He did some great good in our area and in our county in general. But he just kind of stepped on too many toes.
Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier the agrarian, small town, rural approach of Bourbonnais. For many years, there was a story that along is that the Illinois Central Railroad was coming south and being built, and the IC went to Bourbonnais, to the city father, village father, and said, "We want to build a station and serve your community." Supposedly, they were turned down because they were afraid that the trains would scare their horses. That is fiction. It's kind of like...
Oh, it is?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the town fathers of Bourbonnais would have been happily, I think, involved to have a railroad there because you could take your produce and so forth. But the IC bypassed, whenever possible, existing towns. So therefore, they bypassed, the various towns there, and Manteno, Kankakee, Shabance. Further down south, in Champaign County, they bypassed Champaign and built Urbana.
Okay.
So that was and all the way down the line, if you found an existing town in general, they were bypassed. The main reason being that there's a lot more money in selling town lots.
Yes, right.
Than in selling acres and acres of farmland.
It was like a side business to the business, was creating all these towns around the railroad.
We should probably go back to where we started here. We keep.
There's just so much. There's so much spider webbing in this whole thing.
Everything is connected.
It is all connected, but especially with Bourbonnais, since it's such early. Right, early in our county's history. Yeah.
You mentioned, or Jory mentioned, I can't remember, the Bourbonnais as the St. Viator's College and, of course, the Notre Dame convent.
Correct.
Let me do pictures here.
Yes, go ahead, Jory. You had a picture, I think, of St. Viator's. Yeah. That was an advertisement for St. Viator's in one of the Chicago newspapers, and interestingly enough, it labels St. Viator's as being in Kankakee, because people would recognize Kankakee rather than Bourbonnais.
Yep. That is wonderful picture.
That's right.
And then the convent.
Oh yes. In 1860, the priest, the pastor at Bourbonnais at Maternity, requested from the congregation of Notre Dame, which was headquartered in Montreal, an order of nuns, that they send some nuns down to open a school for girls. And so in 1860, 3 CND nuns turned up at the Kankakee depot coming down from Chicago and were met by the pastor from Bourbonnais who escorted them back, and they immediately began to develop a small school for the girls.
Was that school actually in Bourbonnais?
Yes, it was.
Okay.
It was, where that kind of holding pond, and if you're on Convent Street,
Mm-hmm.
to the right, just beyond the church and the current school,
Yes.
there's kind of a low area.
Yes.
Right behind that, in that section, was where they built their school, and it became a very large. Did you show the picture of the school yet? I think we did, but
the school, yeah.
Yeah.
No, not that school.
Oh, that one. Yeah, that's Notre Dame.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was the later version.
It was the later
Eventually,
version,
it became a very large operation. They were essentially a boarding school as well.
Right. Yeah.
They did accept day students from around town, but eventually had a large number of, and they were one of about 6 or 7 boarding schools in the area for young ladies.
There was a lot.
The boarding school closed in 1949, and then eventually the school itself was absorbed by the public school system.
Mm-hmm.
So interestingly enough, the nuns coming to Bourbonnais was before the Viatorians did.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, in 1865, a Viatorian priest and 2 Viatorian brothers came to Bourbonnais and to establish initially a boys' school, since the girls were all being taken care of with
They needed something for the boys.
And that metamorphosed eventually grew into the College of St. Viator.
And there we go.
This
early picture
Yes.
of the campus. There's several buildings. There's a church, the fraternity's here. And these are some of the original buildings. And look at that campus.
I think that was about 1900.
Beautiful.
All
really
grass and the sidewalks and very...
Yeah.
I have some very beautiful pictures, more of the campus. And if anybody is interested in doing a deep dive into Olivet/St. Viator's, I have all the pictures and I have all of the material together in one spot.
No, basically, I was just going to note that it, of course, was a good-sized school. I don't know how many hundred students they had, but they were they fielded quite successful football teams and so forth, and of course trained a lot of priests.
Yes.
One of whom, Fulton J. Sheen, was a graduate of St. Viator, and he had a very, very popular television show in the 50s and so forth, and was always very strongly associated with St. Viator. At one point, somewhere on the campus, there is I think a stone bench, if I recall correctly, that was, when it was still St. Viator College, was given to the college by the alumni from the same year as Bishop Sheen in his honor.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And for a while, I don't think Jory will know for sure on this one, at one time they used to have after Olivet became its successor, they had a St. Viator's room in the administration building.
Yes. Still do.
Do they still have that there?
I think so.
Okay. I'll have to find that out.
Now, it's an interesting setup now because Nazarene took over campus.
Correct.
So it's in the name of Nazarene faith, but you still have Maternity Church that's still adjacent.
Right.
Right.
It's
So
pretty much wrapped into the campus.
So it's kind of all kind of wrapped into one. And
Right.
And you have a little bit of, I think, St. Viator in Maternity as well. There's a little bit of history for that as well.
I'm sure there is.
Church.
So sorry, go ahead, Jack.
I was going to say, the question is, of course, when did St. Viator become Olivet?
Correct.
In 1938, tail end of or the Great Depression and so forth had a serious effect on all kinds of things, but it's definitely on St. Viator's College. They went bankrupt in 1938. Huh?
They had a fire before that.
Oh, they had a fire, a number of years before that, 1920-something, I think. But then they rebuilt the campus, but then the economy went south on them, and they eventually ended up putting the campus up for sale. Down in, not south of Iroquois County, a little further south, the next county south, which escapes me at the moment, there was the town of Olivet, Illinois, which had a small Bible college called Olivet College, obviously.
Yeah.
They unfortunately had a fire in 1938 or somewhere there. And the story is that the trustees of the college of the Olivet, destroyed Olivet building, were driving to Chicago to meet with a real estate agent up there to begin finding some place to rebuild their college. They came up Route 45, I believe, from the south, and as they were going past this building in Bourbonnais, there was a big sign on there saying basically for sale.
Yeah.
And so they looked into it and they found, yes, this is almost ideally situated for them. The price was right, apparently. And so in 1939, St. Viator's College became Olivet Nazarene College. Over the years, of course, they have done an incredible number of expansions of the college, have built some gorgeous buildings, and have, at first, the early years of Olivet were a little uneasy on the part of both sides. I think the Bourbonnais natives were a little bit iffy on as far as this, because they were mostly Catholic.
Yes.
French Catholic.
And the Nazarenes, of course, were Protestant. And, of course, the Nazarenes were a little uneasy because they were surrounded by this town of people who weren't really necessarily very accepting to them.
There wasn't a big Nazarene population.
That's right. Yeah, as far as the native Nazarene population.
Right.
But over the years, there's been a real sea change, I think. Olivet has become a very vital part of Bourbonnais. And
the whole county, really.
Yes.
The whole county.
Several churches in the whole area, Nazarene, have become.
But they have become a real asset to the community, and I think that the growth of Bourbonnais, with many fresh faces coming in, people from other backgrounds, the growth of has helped to blend this all together into a much more suitable relationship.
Cohesive.
I mean, I know that,
Yes.
For example, one of my grandsons graduated from Bradley Bourbonnais Community High School. Their graduation ceremonies were held at Olivet, at the Hawkins Chapel.
Yeah.
As have any number of things. The Kankakee Symphony plays there.
Yes, they do.
There are many other events taking place on the campus, and the campus also, or the administration, does a lot of outreach. There's a huge number of local among the student body. I don't know what the percentage is, but I have the feeling that it's a pretty high percentage of that student body is local day students.
Yeah.
Those living on campus.
I don't know. I forget what their population is during, when school is in session, but I do know, like at time of recording, I think 2020, well, I guess it would have been 2024, right? Their 2024 to 2025 school year, I think is the highest enrollment that they've ever had for students on campus.
That's right.
And I forget exactly what the number is, but to this day, that's the most that they've ever had. And that doesn't even speak for all of the graduate students that attend online classes too.
That's
that
right.
all of that
Yes.
has. yeah, it really has played a huge part, as you said, Jack, in growing Bourbonnais into a more diverse area, bringing people in from different parts of the country.
That's right.
And honestly, I think it's a big part of helping get teachers into our schools.
Oh, definitely.
Because I can't
education majors.
I can't tell you how many of the teachers I had in grade school or high school were graduates
of Olivet.
Olivet.
Oh, yes.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
One thing that I just remembered talking about education, that maternity at a school that still existed, where a lot of early churches, not just Catholic, but a lot of the early churches all over had their own schools.
Yes,
that's right.
And of course, a lot of them, of course, disappeared. Maternity was one that stayed, and it's still used today, but it's just called a different name because it combined with St. Joe's.
Yeah.
Yes, it's now Bishop McNamara.
Yes, it's all Bishop McNamara.
But that education stayed with the church,
Correct.
which is very unusual in today's world, but very interesting part of our history.
Yeah, I actually spent a couple of years there myself in grade school.
Yeah.
I went to maternity for kindergarten and first grade and most of fourth grade. So I spent some time there, and that was when it was maternity and not Bishop Mac. So,
but also, or speaking of Olivet, something that helped to put Bourbonnais on the map was also related to the college. The Chicago Bears, of course, were selected with a little push from Governor George Ryan.
It helps when you've got, a governor from Kankakee in office.
In 2002, the Chicago Bears began holding their practices, their training camp at Bourbonnais at Olivet. And it was a very useful, I think both sides found that very useful. And it did put Kankakee and Bourbonnais on the map. The Bears training camp ran until 2019, when, of course, they went back to Hallis Hall. The interesting thing is the growth of Bourbonnais. When we were talking about, it was always a small town. When in 1900, it had 595. The 1900 population was 595. The 2000 population was 15,000 some odd.
Wow.
So in a century, they gained an awful lot. There were actually two bursts of growth in Bourbonnais as far as population was concerned, most of which was partly tied into industry moving here and bringing down people. The other, just in general, the idea of jobs available and residences. The first of the bursts of it was 50s and 60s, I think. You had a pretty good sized bump, and they went, well over 1,000. Let me see if I.
Well, and again, going back to Olivet, a lot of people that graduated, and still this happens when they graduate from Olivet, they end up staying here
because they find a job here or whatever, right?
And to this day, there still are not a lot of factories.
Yes.
In Bourbonnais. Armor Pharmaceutical, which is now
CSL Bearing. That is still there, and it's become a humongous complex.
Correct.
We had Bungie, which is now part of
it's now part of CSL, yeah.
And we have a steel in this.
Birmingham
factory.
Steel.
But we really don't have, and still in Bourbonnais, a lot of factories.
It's still essentially a residential community.
Is Nucor not part of? Is Nucor part of Bradley, or is Nucor part of Bourbonnais?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure because the lines out there are so funny because of the shopping centers up and down 50 are all part of Bradley.
They're all part of Bradley, and Nucor is right over.
I think though that Nucor Steel probably is. It's on the other side of the tracks.
If you look at a map of Bradley, Bourbonnais, and Kankakee, a modern today map, you'll find that it's very interesting, the annexation of Bradley territories.
Yes.
And then with the annexation of Bourbonnais, it's very interesting to look at the boundaries.
There's a lot of movement. The
Yes.
line moves a lot.
And
Ken Hayes
no
was a
straight
very smart
lines
man when he
anywhere.
was the mayor of Bourbonnais.
That's another episode for another
He led
day.
the annexations and so forth that made this into the powerhouse that Bradley has become.
Right.
But
Yeah.
I was talking about the boom in
in the
Bourbonnais.
50s and 60s.
Yeah, 50s and 60s. The population in 1950 was 1,598. In 1960 census was 3,300. But then you get into the late 70s and early 80s. Suddenly, the population of Bourbonnais is 13,000.
Wow.
Up from, in 10 years, more than doubled, almost tripled. The development of residential subdivisions, especially to the north and somewhat to the east of Bourbonnais, has been incredible. And but the mid-1980s, that all pretty much came to a halt because of the state of the economy and the fact we lost several of our larger employers and so forth when the different places like Roper and A.O. Smith shut down.
Yeah.
But now that they're continuing, it's sort of, there's beginning to see some additional building and so forth.
There's actually a need for it, and that's one of the main topics. Right now we're in the middle of election cycle here in the county, and that's been one of the hot topics is new housing. How do we get it?
Popping back to Olivet for a moment, I just happened to run across something that I think we need to mention. 17th of April, 1963. Tornado.
Yes.
Tornado roared through Kankakee County. It hit Traylorville outside of Bourbonnais.
Mm-hmm.
It killed a woman there and took some severe damage to several of the buildings in Olivet. It also destroyed the century-old stained glass windows on the south side of Maternity BVM Church. The Olivet, I recall when, again, I mentioned I came to town in 1963, and it was, I think, in August or thereabouts I came to town to work for the Journal. But I noticed in driving into town the damage to the administration building at Olivet that was still in the process of being rebuilt. And it was amazing. That's, I think, the worst tornado we've ever had in the county as far as
I believe
hitting
so.
You've had others cause more physical damage. For example, Grant Park, which they had a tornado there that just wiped out the tile works out there, for example.
Correct. But as far as I think that's probably the closest it's gotten to the urban Tri-City,
area.
The urban area.
That's right. Yeah. Generally speaking, the tornadoes have kind of skirted around the urban areas.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We've been lucky, very lucky.
Another area, a couple blocks away from Olivet, the place called The Grove.
Yes, The Grove,
which is a really multi-million-dollar development that has kind of, I think, an attempt to give Bourbonnais a central core because it was kind of just spread out strip mall kind of a development in the past.
There was never that, I guess, historic downtown like
real
a lot
downtown.
of the other downtowns or like the other towns have, know, Moments and Mantino and Kankakee.
That's
and,
right.
They all have this historic downtown.
That's right.
And Bourbonnais has never had that.
We did. Bourbonnais did. The intersection where it's a Y.
The Y was
where in the road convent and 102, that busy intersection. There used to be fire department there and City Hall, Village Hall, and I think maybe one other building that were situated in that adjusted area.
Okay.
It's sort of like a Y kind of shape.
Well, I retract my statement then.
Well, in a way,
We have pictures too, not here, but I have them at the museum of those buildings in
you
that
had
area.
a number of small businesses along Main Street, and then where the area where the former pizza place and now tequila, whatever is,
where Beggars was.
that were part of that. But actually, there was no traditional center in the same sense, I think, as it is. Also, the Grove opened in August this past year. Right?
Yes, correct.
And 12 and a half acres behind the village hall, which has been traditionally the site where the Friendship Festival is held.
Yep, still is.
Which, by the way, is the 50th one coming up this year.
Yeah, coincide
2025. It's a very interesting development. I just happened to be out in that direction and looking at I never realized until I looked closely at it, they built a hill. Yeah,
they did. They made a hill for sledding.
For sledding and for concerts.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But it looks like a very interesting activity, and it was, I think that's going to begin to develop to bring people into the area for various events to give it a little more life rather than being a drive-through.
Yes, exactly. It's been really nice to see all the different things they're doing there, which should mention, since we're talking about the 150th anniversary of Bourbonnais, the Soirée de Bourbonnais to celebrate the 150th anniversary is happening at the Bourbonnais Grove on May 17th. So if people want to go to that and celebrate Bourbonnais' birthday, is that sponsored by the village or by I think it's a juncture between the village and the Bourbonnais Grove Historical Society. Yeah. So as far as I know, because I know the village of Bourbonnais has been posting on it on their social media accounts. So I assume the Grove Historical Society is tied in with that, I would think.
Speaking of the Historical Society, I think that's worth noting that they have an excellent museum in the old Laterno house, and of course, right next door, the log cabin.
Yes.
They're very active. They have a core of very dedicated people involved. Dr. Jim Paul, for example, I think is president, and of course, a number of people, and I can't mention them by name because there are too many of them, but they have a very active historical society. They do a lot of good things, and I think that the community is lucky to have someone to look after the heritage.
Yes, absolutely. We're very grateful for the Bourbonnais Grove Historical Society and all they do to preserve the history of Bourbonnais.
And as members of the Kankakee County Historical Society, we're glad to have fellow organizations like that. We do work together on various projects and so forth.
Absolutely. I know that swapping artifacts for exhibits and things like that too. There are some times where I know the Kankakee County Museum will call upon like the Bourbonnais Grove Historical Society or any of the other historical societies and say, hey, we got this, this temporary exhibit we're doing. Is there a chance we could loan that painting you have at your, museum or whatever artifact it might be?
Yeah. And now Jory, for example, does programs at other historical societies in the community. I used to. I've kind of retired from that sort of thing, but
don't quote me on this, but I know that there's either a sister city to Bourbonnais or they're trying to create.
They're trying to create it. There was a group that just went very, very recently. Veronica Featherston, our executive
director
at the museum, went on that. And they said they had a wonderful time with the people there. They couldn't speak English very well, but they really got along and they really felt that they had so much in common. And they were very happy. We were very happy. So I think they're really trying to get that established in whatever formalities they need to do. And so we're really excited about that. As our museum, part of it, and as Bourbonnais, the town, being a part of that would be wonderful.
Yeah, it really would be. I mean, and I think that's one thing they're trying to, I think, solidify for the 150th anniversary is finally, establish that tie. Yeah. And so that it's always documented, this is where the bulk of, the French Canadians that settled here, this is where they were from.
I think they felt that their town, their community, their heritage, outside of their country had been preserved so well. I think they're very happy about that, to talk to people who came from them and established and are still going strong today. And that's had to have been a wonderful, wonderful feeling for the French
Heritage Museum, of course, attracts a lot of visitors from Canada and from many other areas too, I think.
And that's our attempt to preserve French heritage community. That's our other campus in downtown Kankakee. Come visit us.
Yes.
We, of course, are part of the French Heritage Corridor, which along Interstate 57. If you go along, you'll find occasionally a sign saying French Heritage Corridor on Interstate 57.
Which means there's a lot of states in the Union that collectively had French influence, French settlement, all the way down to New Orleans. New Orleans, New Orleans, or I should say Nouveau Orleans. But so it goes all the way down, like around the Mississippi, I believe.
Yes,
that's pretty much.
You have the early settlements down in Missouri and then along across the Mississippi.
Yeah. Well, Jack and Jory, if there's nothing else, which there's always more. There's always.
We could generally go about 8 hours.
We could, especially like I said, this one. There's just so much history when it comes to Bourbonnais. But what we really want to say is happy 150th birthday to Bourbonnais. You've never looked better.
Yes.
And, anyone that has been a part of, Bourbonnais' history and really making it the place that it is today, we just want to thank those people because really it's a community,
Right.
We all came together and we made Bourbonnais the way it is today. And we're thankful for everything that all of, from the forefathers, if you will, and to the people currently that are making things happen, in the village. So thank you to all of them. And thank you to the Kankakee County Museum as well for always doing the history episodes with us. So make sure you visit either the main campus in Kankakee or the French Heritage Museum. You can go to KankakeeCountyMuseum.com to get more information and also find out how you can become a member and directly support the museum, their efforts into preserving our history. Thank you both again.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us with you.
That concludes this episode of Kankakee Podcast. I'm Jake LaMore. Thank you so much for listening. Please tap that subscribe button if you haven't already. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn at Kankakee Podcast. Shout out to Alex Kerner for supporting the show each month through Patreon. If you want your name announced on a future episode, you can sign up at patreon.com/Kankakee Podcast. Special thanks to our sponsors, Chicago Dough Company, Noble Dairy Queen Stores, KCC's Office of Continuing Education and Business Partnerships, Frank's Appliance Center and Sleep Source, Bigosh Engineering, King Music, Little Me Studio, Edward Jones Financial Advisor Adam Elroy, Taco John's, D. Westfall Jewelers, Nana's Bakery, and Stafari West Avenue. Kankakee Podcast is produced by Pathfinder, a full-service marketing agency in downtown Kankakee. You can learn more at yourpathfinder.io. Our theme song is by Lupe Carroll.